are slowly floating into a deep, peaceful sleep.
Reason one life had a set price in law. In Anglo-Saxon England, the law placed a fixed money value on every person's life through a system known as wergild. This payment was required if someone was killed, but the amount depended entirely on social rank. A nobleman was worth far more silver than a common farmer, and a slave's value was lower still. The law did not treat all lives equally. It calculated them. If a person was killed, the responsible family had to pay the set amount to prevent revenge. If they could not pay, a feud could begin and continue for years between families. Protection therefore depended not only on innocence or justice, but on status and wealth. A person born into a poor household automatically had less legal protection than someone born into power. This created a society where safety was tied to hierarchy. Disputes were often settled through payment rather than imprisonment. Since prisons were not widely used in the modern sense, the system aimed to reduce endless bloodshed. Yet it also reminded everyone that human value was measured in silver coins. For a modern individual accustomed to equal legal standing regardless of birth, adapting to a world where your life carried a preassigned price based on rank would require accepting a structure where identity determined protection. Survival was influenced not only by strength or skill, but by family position and inherited status. Reason 2 shared living space with animals. Many families lived in small wooden houses that had only one main room, and animals such as cows, goats, or sheep were often kept very close to the home, sometimes even inside at night. Livestock was extremely valuable because it provided milk, meat, wool, and labor for farming. Protecting animals from theft or wolves was necessary for survival. However, keeping animals nearby created constant discomfort. The smell of manure mixed with smoke from the indoor fire and stayed trapped inside because houses had no proper chimneys. The air was thick, especially during winter when doors and openings were kept closed to preserve warmth. Parasites such as fleas could move between animals and people easily. Noise did not stop at night, as animals shifted, breathed heavily, or made sudden sounds. Waste had to be removed by hand, and during wet seasons the ground outside became muddy and difficult to clean. Illness could spread more easily when humans and animals lived so closely together. For a modern person used to separate living spaces, plumbing, and controlled ventilation, adjusting to constant exposure to animal smells, insects, and smoke would be physically and mentally exhausting. In this environment, comfort was secondary to survival, and personal space was almost non-existent. Reason 3. Trial by ordeal. In Anglo-Saxon England, the legal system sometimes decided guilt through dangerous physical tests called ordeals. One common method was holding a hot iron or carrying it over a distance. If the person's burns healed well, they were considered innocent. If not, guilty. These tests were based on the belief that divine power would protect the innocent. There was no medical treatment provided during the ordeal, so even minor burns could become infected. People feared not only the pain, but also the risk of long-term injury or death. Ordeals were public events, watched by the whole community, which added pressure and humiliation. The process was unpredictable. Luck, skill, or prior health could influence the outcome more than actual innocence. For ordinary people, the threat of being forced into an ordeal was terrifying, as survival depended partly on chance. Even those accused wrongly could face permanent scars or serious disability. Modern justice systems rely on evidence and fairness. But in this world, law intertwined closely with superstition and belief. Daily life included the awareness that a simple accusation could put your body and life at extreme risk. The ordeal was a constant reminder that survival in Anglo-Saxon society required not just hard work, but endurance under rules far harsher than we experience today. Reason for drinking beer every day. In Anglo-Saxon England, most people drank beer every day instead of water because streams and wells were often contaminated. Water could carry deadly germs, making sickness common if consumed untreated. Beer was safer because the brewing process involved boiling, which killed many harmful bacteria. However, the beer was usually very weak compared to modern standards, more like a mild, cloudy ale, and it was consumed in large amounts to stay hydrated. Children and adults alike drank it, sometimes from the same communal cup, which could still spread illness. Brewing was done at home or in small local facilities, so the quality varied greatly. People relied on beer not only for hydration but also as a source of calories during long workdays. While it helped prevent waterborne diseases, it did not replace the need for nutritious food, which was limited. For a modern person, drinking alcohol daily for survival might seem strange or even dangerous, but in this society, it was a practical necessity. Dependence on beer illustrates how daily habits were shaped by environmental risks and limited knowledge of germs. Hydration, nutrition, and safety were all intertwined, and survival required adapting to customs that balanced risk with available resources. Reason 5. Deadly toothaches. In Anglo-Saxon England, a simple toothache could become life-threatening because there was no real dental care. Cavities, infections, or broken teeth were common, and even small problems could turn into serious abscesses. People sometimes tried home remedies such as herbal poultices, saltwater rinses, or pulling teeth with crude tools, but these methods often caused more pain or infection. Medical knowledge was limited, so doctors could not reliably treat infections. If an abscess spread, it could lead to sepsis, a deadly blood infection, which often killed the person. Pain was constant, and untreated dental problems could make eating difficult, leading to malnutrition. Poor oral hygiene combined with limited diet made tooth decay widespread. For a modern person used to dentists, antibiotics, and pain relief, living with untreated dental problems would be unbearable. Surviving daily life required enduring constant pain while still performing hard labor, farming, or defending oneself. Even simple actions like chewing bread or handling tools could become agonizing. Dental health was a hidden danger that affected everyone, rich or poor, and could strike suddenly without warning. In this way, something as ordinary as a toothache became a serious threat to life in Anglo-Saxon society. Reason 6. Houses without chimneys. Most homes in Anglo-Saxon England had no chimneys, so smoke from the central fire filled the living space. Fires were essential for cooking and heating, but the smoke made breathing difficult and irritated the eyes over time. The smoke would linger, especially in winter when doors and windows were kept closed to preserve warmth. Roof openings let some smoke escape, but ventilation was minimal, and soot often coated the walls and ceilings. Prolonged exposure could lead to chronic coughing, lung problems, and general discomfort. The smell of smoke mixed with other household odors, including animals kept nearby, created a harsh environment. Families had to balance warmth and light with the hazards of smoke. Children were especially vulnerable, as they spent most of their time near the hearth. For a modern person used to clean air and heating systems, living in a smoke-filled room would be exhausting and potentially dangerous. Survival required endurance, and daily life involved constant exposure to this uncomfortable but necessary condition. Despite the risks, fires were indispensable for warmth, cooking, and protection, making smoky homes a standard reality for everyone in the village. Reason 7 children started work very young. In Anglo-Saxon England, children did not have long periods of play or formal schooling like today. From a very young age, they were expected to help with daily survival tasks. Boys often assisted with farming, tending animals, or carrying water, while girls helped with cooking, cleaning, and caring for younger siblings. Learning practical skills was essential because survival depended on every family member contributing. Hard labor began as early as 5 or 6 years old in some households. Mistakes could be dangerous. A dropped tool or mismanaged animal could harm both the child and the family's livelihood. Education focused on practical knowledge rather than reading or writing. Except for some children in monasteries, the work was physical and relentless, leaving little time for rest. For modern viewers, imagining children handling heavy chores, long hours, and exposure to harsh weather seems extreme. Yet in that society, it was normal and necessary for survival. Children quickly learned responsibility, endurance, and the skills they would need for adulthood. This early labor shaped both body and mind, making youth a time of training rather than leisure. Daily life for children was dominated by work, with safety and comfort secondary to family and survival needs. Reason 8 little bathing in winter. In Anglo-Saxon England, people bathed very little during the cold winter months. Water sources were often icy, scarce, or contaminated, making regular washing difficult and uncomfortable. Bathing usually involved washing hands, face, and feet, with full-body baths being rare except on special occasions. Soap was limited and mostly made from animal fat or ash, which could irritate the skin. Cold temperatures made staying warm after a bath a challenge, especially in homes with no chimneys or proper heating. As a result, people carried layers of dirt, sweat, and smoke from indoor fires on their skin and clothes. Hygiene was limited, and lice or other parasites were common. Despite these conditions, people developed routines to stay as clean as possible, such as rubbing with sand, herbs, or cloths. For someone from modern society, living with minimal washing and constant exposure to dirt, smoke, and body odor would feel uncomfortable and unhygienic. However, in that time, it was a normal part of life, and survival often meant prioritizing warmth, food, and work over personal cleanliness. Enduring this was just part of daily life in Anglo-Saxon villages. Reason 9 long-lasting family feuds. In Anglo-Saxon England, conflicts between families could continue for generations. Disputes over land, livestock, or honor often escalated into long-standing feuds. The law sometimes offered solutions, like payments through wergild, but if payments were refused or incomplete, revenge could continue. Children inherited these disputes, and families stayed alert to potential attacks from rival households. Violence could erupt unexpectedly, affecting daily routines, farming, or travel. Villagers often had to carry weapons or remain cautious even while performing ordinary tasks. The social pressure to defend family honor was constant, and failing to do so could lead to ridicule or danger. Feuds made ordinary life unpredictable, as even small arguments could escalate into serious harm. For modern viewers, living under the threat of multi-generational revenge seems extreme, but in that society, Survival depended on vigilance, loyalty, and readiness to respond to threats. Daily life was shaped by these tensions, influencing where people went, who they trusted, and how they acted in their own community. Managing relationships and respecting social codes was as important as food, shelter, or work. Reason 10. Sudden Viking raids. Viking ships could appear unexpectedly along coasts and rivers, bringing violence and destruction to villages in Anglo-Saxon England. These raids were fast and brutal, often targeting farms, monasteries, and small settlements. Villagers had little warning and few defenses. A small community could be overwhelmed in hours. Raiders stole livestock, food, and valuables, and sometimes kidnapped people to sell as slaves. Families were forced to flee, hide, or fight with simple weapons. The constant threat of raids meant that daily life included fear and preparation. People built defensive structures like ditches, fences, or small watchtowers when possible. But many homes remained vulnerable. Even inland villages could be affected if raiders pushed upriver. Children, the elderly, and the sick were especially at risk, and the psychological impact of living with sudden danger was immense. For someone from modern times, the unpredictability and speed of such attacks would be terrifying. Survival required vigilance, quick thinking, and the ability to endure extreme stress. Communities depended heavily on teamwork, warning signals, and local knowledge to minimize losses. The fear of Viking raids shaped both the architecture of villages and the routines of daily life. Reason 11. Deadly cuts from everyday work. In Anglo-Saxon England, even a small cut while working in the fields could become deadly. Farming required constant contact with sharp tools, heavy wooden plows, and animals, and accidents were common. If a blade nicked the skin, it could easily become infected because there was no knowledge of germs or antiseptics. Minor wounds often turned into serious abscesses, leading to fever, sepsis, or even death. Daily chores like harvesting crops, chopping wood, or tending livestock carried this constant risk. Children and adults alike were vulnerable, and families relied on one another for basic care, though treatment options were limited to herbs, poultices, or prayers. Even a simple fall or scratch could quickly escalate into a life-threatening problem. People learned to be careful, but mistakes were often unavoidable. For a modern person used to disinfectants, bandages, and antibiotics, the risk of dying from a small injury would feel extreme. Survival in this environment depended on caution, experience, and sometimes sheer luck. Every day presented hidden dangers that could strike without warning, making even ordinary tasks potentially fatal in a society without advanced medical care. Reason 12. Hard dirt floors. In Anglo-Saxon homes, floors were usually just hard-packed dirt rather than wood or stone. These floors could become cold, damp, and uneven, especially during wet seasons. Mud tracked inside from outside added to the discomfort, and cleaning was difficult with limited tools. Dust and dirt easily mixed with smoke from the hearth, creating an unpleasant air quality. Sleeping directly on straw or rush mats on these floors exposed families to insects, cold, and moisture. Children often played or worked on these surfaces, increasing contact with dirt and germs. The lack of insulation made the floors chilly in winter and uncomfortable in summer. For modern viewers, living on a dirt floor would feel harsh and unsanitary, especially with little personal space. Families had to accept these conditions as normal, balancing warmth from fires and the practical need for simplicity with comfort. The floors were functional rather than pleasant, reflecting a society focused on survival and practicality over luxury or cleanliness. Daily life included constant awareness of the environment, as even the ground beneath you could affect health and comfort. Reason 13. Bugs in stored grain. In Anglo-Saxon England, grain was often stored in simple containers like wooden bins or sacks, which could not fully protect it from pests. Insects such as weevils, beetles, and moths frequently infested the grain, eating some of it and contaminating the rest. This made food supplies unpredictable, as portions could be ruined before they were eaten. Families relied heavily on grain for bread, porridge, and ale, so infestations posed a serious threat to survival. Cleaning and monitoring storage was labor-intensive, and there were no chemical treatments to prevent pests. People sometimes sifted, heated, or froze grain to reduce bugs, but these methods were not always effective. Contaminated grain could cause sickness if eaten, adding another risk. For modern individuals used to sealed packaging and pest control, the idea of everyday food being invaded by insects seems alarming. Survival required constant attention, careful handling, and acceptance of imperfection in the food supply. This everyday danger shows how even the basics of life, like stored food, carried hidden threats, making daily planning, storage, and rationing critical for survival in Anglo-Saxon villages. Reason 14. No trained doctors. In Anglo-Saxon England, most villages had no trained doctors or formal medical facilities. When people became sick or injured, treatment relied on family members, local healers, or simple herbal remedies. Knowledge of medicine was limited, and there was little understanding of germs or infection. Illnesses that are minor today, like fevers or cuts, could quickly become life-threatening. Herbs, prayers, and rituals were common treatments, but they were inconsistent and often ineffective. Severe injuries or internal diseases usually went untreated, leaving people to rely on their body's natural healing. Traveling to find a skilled healer was difficult and sometimes impossible, especially in winter or during floods. Children, the elderly, and those with chronic conditions were especially vulnerable. For modern viewers, the absence of professional medical care would seem shocking. Survival depended not only on avoiding sickness, but also on being resourceful with limited remedies. Communities developed practical knowledge of herbs and basic treatments, but these were no guarantee of safety. Daily life included the constant awareness that any illness or injury could have serious consequences, making caution, observation, and preparation essential for survival. Reason 15. Hunger after a bad harvest. In Anglo-Saxon England, a single poor harvest could leave a family without enough food for months. Farming relied on simple tools, unpredictable weather, and basic knowledge of soil and crops. Droughts, floods, or early frosts could destroy fields, leaving little grain to eat or store for winter. Families often had only small reserves of dried grain, which could run out quickly. With few alternatives, people survived on roots, wild plants, or very thin porridge. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making illness more dangerous and reducing strength for daily labor. Children and the elderly were especially affected, as they required more care and food relative to body size. Hunger could also force people to travel in search of food, exposing them to thieves, wild animals, or harsh weather. Sharing limited resources was essential, and family disputes could arise when food was scarce. For someone from modern society, where food is plentiful and preserved, experiencing months of near starvation would feel extreme. Survival required careful rationing, knowledge of edible plants, and resilience to endure the physical and mental strain caused by hunger. This constant risk made farming and food storage central to life in every Anglo-Saxon village. Reason 16. Little food preservation. In Anglo-Saxon England, people had very few ways to preserve food for long periods. Meat, dairy, and bread could spoil quickly, especially during warm or wet weather. Salt was used occasionally, but it was expensive and not always available. Smoking meat or drying grain helped, but these methods were limited and required skill and time. Without proper storage, families often had to eat food quickly or risk losing it to rot or pests. Spoiled food could cause serious illness, including food poisoning, which could be fatal. Vegetables and fruits lasted only a short time after harvest, and storage in cool, dry cellars was rare. People had to plan meals carefully and rely on seasonal availability. For modern viewers used to refrigerators, freezers, and packaged foods, this lack of preservation would seem dangerous and uncomfortable. Survival required constant attention to food, careful preparation, and awareness of spoilage. The risk of losing precious food meant that families had to be disciplined, resourceful, and cautious, balancing immediate needs with limited storage options. Daily life was deeply tied to the availability and safety of what could be eaten each day. Reason 17. Limited clothing. Most people in Anglo-Saxon England owned only a few pieces of clothing. Clothes were handmade from wool or linen and had to last for years. Daily wear could become worn, torn, or infested with lice and fleas. Washing was rare, especially in winter, and drying thick wool garments could take days. People layered clothes for warmth, but during rain or snow, clothing could stay wet, causing discomfort, illness, or frostbite. Shoes were simple and offered little protection from mud, stones, or cold. Wealthy families had more garments, often decorated with embroidery, but most common people had only what was necessary to survive. Hand-me-downs were normal, and repairs were done repeatedly to extend the life of every piece. For a modern person accustomed to multiple outfits, easy laundry, and weatherproof clothing, living with so few clothes would feel limiting and uncomfortable. Survival required practical adaptation, using what you had carefully, accepting wear and tear, and enduring cold, wet, or uncomfortable conditions. Clothing was not about fashion. It was a tool for warmth, protection, and modesty, and daily life revolved around making it last as long as possible. Reason 18. Rough roads. Roads in Anglo-Saxon England were not properly built or maintained. Most paths were simple dirt tracks, often muddy after rain or uneven from frequent use by carts, animals, and foot traffic. Traveling even short distances could take hours or days, depending on weather and terrain. Bridges were rare, so rivers and streams had to be crossed carefully, sometimes on slippery stones or by wading through cold water. Traveling long distances exposed people to accidents, falling, or animal attacks. Villagers relied on these paths for trade, communication, and visiting neighbors. But journeys were slow and unpredictable. There were no signs, maps, or road maintenance crews like today. Supplies and messages could be delayed for days, and travelers often had to carry everything they might need themselves. For modern viewers used to paved roads, cars, and traffic signals, life on such rough tracks would seem inconvenient and risky. Survival required patience, careful planning, and physical endurance. Daily routines depended heavily on the condition of the paths, and bad weather could isolate communities entirely. Roads were practical, but slow, uncomfortable, and sometimes dangerous. Reason 19. Long travel times. Traveling to another town in Anglo-Saxon England could take days on foot. Without cars for everyone, most people walked, carrying their belongings in simple sacks or baskets. Terrain was rough, with dirt paths, hills, rivers, and forests to navigate. Bad weather, rain, snow, or mud could slow progress or make journeys impossible. Travelers faced risks from wild animals, robbers, or getting lost in dense forests. Inns or guest houses were rare, so overnight stays often meant sleeping outdoors or in simple shelters. Food and water had to be carried or found along the way, and delays could leave travelers hungry or exhausted. Communication between villages was slow, making trade, news, or family visits difficult. For someone used to modern transportation like cars or trains, this long, tiring, and sometimes dangerous travel would feel extreme. Survival required careful planning, endurance, and awareness of surroundings. Journeys could take longer than expected, and delays had real consequences, such as missing market days or being caught in bad weather. Daily life depended on how far and how safely people could move between communities. Reason 20. Floods destroying farms and homes. In Anglo-Saxon England, heavy rains or overflowing rivers could flood fields and villages, ruining crops and homes. Most settlements were built near rivers for water and transportation, but this came with constant risk. Flooded land meant loss of food and income, leaving families vulnerable to hunger or debt. Homes made of wood and thatch could be damaged or even swept away, forcing people to rebuild with limited resources. Livestock might drown or escape, reducing another essential source of food and labor. Flooding also spread disease, as water mixed with waste and stagnant pools formed near living areas. Villagers had few tools to control or prevent floods, relying instead on small ditches, embankments, or temporary barriers. For modern viewers used to flood warnings, drainage systems, and emergency services, living with sudden, unpredictable floods would seem terrifying. Survival required quick action, careful observation of weather, and sometimes accepting losses as unavoidable. Daily life was intertwined with natural forces, and the ability to respond to environmental challenges could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Floods were a constant, unpredictable danger that shaped both work and shelter in Anglo-Saxon communities. Reason 21. Easily flammable thatched roofs. In Anglo-Saxon England, most homes had roofs made of straw or reeds, which could catch fire very easily. A small spark from the central hearth, a lightning strike, or even nearby fires could set a roof ablaze. Once a fire started, it spread quickly. As the houses were close together and made of wood, there was little firefighting equipment, so people often had to rely on buckets of water, sand, or smothering with blankets. Fires could destroy not only homes, but also stored food, tools, and livestock, leaving families without shelter or resources. Smoke inhalation added another danger, especially for children and the elderly. Villagers had to stay alert when cooking or using fire indoors. For modern viewers, Living under a constant risk of accidental fire would feel alarming. Survival required caution, quick thinking, and preparedness. Daily life was shaped by the need to manage open flames carefully, balance warmth with safety, and accept that a careless moment could cause a devastating disaster. The danger of thatched roofs was a persistent reminder of how fragile shelter could be in this era. Reason 22. Smoke damaging lungs. In Anglo-Saxon homes, smoke from the central fire filled the small, poorly ventilated rooms. Without chimneys, smoke drifted through the house, making breathing difficult and irritating eyes. Over time, constant exposure could cause chronic coughing, lung irritation, and other respiratory problems. Children and the elderly were especially affected, as they spent most of their time indoors. Smoke mixed with odors from animals, cooking, and waste, creating thick, unpleasant air. During winter, when doors and windows stayed closed to keep warmth in, the problem worsened. Families had no way to filter or remove smoke, and even avoiding the hearth was difficult because it was the main source of heat and cooking. For modern viewers, living in constant smoke would seem unbearable and unhealthy. Survival required endurance and adaptation to the discomfort. People grew used to coughing, watery eyes, and the smell as a normal part of life. Smoke was necessary for warmth and cooking, so there was no choice but to endure its effects, showing how daily survival often meant accepting slow, hidden dangers that could affect health over a lifetime. Reason 23. Long, dark winters. Winters in Anglo-Saxon England were long, cold, and very dark, especially in northern regions. With few sources of light, mostly small fires, candles, or rushlights, days felt shorter, and nights stretched for many hours. Cold penetrated homes with thin walls and dirt floors, making it difficult to stay warm, even near the central hearth. Limited food during winter added to the hardship, as crops were gone and livestock were harder to feed. Travel became dangerous or impossible due to snow, ice, or mud, isolating villages from neighbors and markets. Illnesses spread more easily in close, cold, and crowded living conditions. People had to wear layers of wool and huddle together for warmth. Children spent more time indoors, but homes were smoky and uncomfortable. For modern viewers accustomed to heating, electricity, and long daylight, enduring such winters would seem harsh and exhausting. Survival depended on preparation, storing enough food, keeping fires burning, layering clothing, and conserving energy. Daily life slowed, and people had to adjust routines around light, weather, and temperature, making winter a season of endurance rather than ease. Reason 24. Robbers on lonely roads. Traveling in Anglo-Saxon England was risky because lonely roads and forest paths were often targeted by robbers. Villagers, traders, and messengers could be attacked for money, food, or valuables, and there was little organized law enforcement to protect them. Travelers had to stay alert, carry weapons, and sometimes travel in groups for safety. Dense forests and rough terrain made it easy for thieves to hide and ambush unsuspecting people. Even routine trips to neighboring villages could become dangerous, and timing or route choices could determine survival. Those caught alone or unprepared risked theft, injury, or death. For modern viewers used to police patrols, streetlights, and secure roads, this constant threat would seem extreme. Survival required vigilance, local knowledge, and caution at all times. Daily life was influenced by the need to avoid dangerous routes, plan travel carefully, and maintain weapons or tools for protection. The presence of robbers shaped routines, limiting mobility and making even ordinary travel a potential hazard. Reason 25. Common lice and bugs. In Anglo-Saxon England, lice, fleas, and other tiny insects were a constant part of daily life. People lived in close quarters with animals, shared bedding, and rarely bathed, which made it easy for parasites to spread. Lice infested hair, clothing, and bedding, causing itching, discomfort, and skin infections. Fleas from animals could bite humans, leaving sores and sometimes transmitting disease. Simple cleaning methods like combing hair or washing clothes in cold water were only partially effective. Homes were smoky from indoor fires, but smoke did little to remove pests. Children were especially vulnerable, spending long hours near animals and in shared sleeping spaces. For modern viewers used to hygiene routines, insect infestations would seem unbearable and unhealthy. Survival meant learning to tolerate constant itching, discomfort, and minor infections. Daily life included regular efforts to control pests, such as brushing, changing straw bedding, and inspecting clothing. Despite these efforts, bugs were unavoidable, illustrating how even small, persistent threats shaped health, comfort, and routines in Anglo-Saxon households. Reason 26. Dirty drinking water. In Anglo-Saxon England, most people drank water from streams, rivers, or shallow wells that were often contaminated. These sources could carry parasites, bacteria, and other harmful substances, causing diarrhea, fevers, and other illnesses. Boiling water was not common, so drinking untreated water was a daily risk. People sometimes relied on beer instead, which was safer because the brewing process killed some germs, but it was weak and could not fully replace hydration. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable to waterborne sickness. Villages had no organized sanitation system, and waste often entered nearby water sources, increasing contamination. For modern viewers used to clean tap water and filtration, this constant risk would seem shocking. Survival required knowledge of safer sources, careful observation of water quality, and sometimes avoiding water altogether. Daily life involved balancing thirst, nutrition, and disease risk. Access to clean water was limited, so even basic hydration carried hidden dangers, shaping routines, food preparation, and health in every household. Reason 27. One-room homes. Most Anglo-Saxon families lived in single-room houses where cooking, sleeping, and daily work all took place together. Space was tight, and privacy was almost non-existent. Families shared this small area with children, sometimes elderly relatives, and even animals. The central hearth provided heat and a place to cook, but smoke filled the room and made air quality poor. Floors were dirt, walls were thin, and insulation was minimal, so the room could be cold, damp, or drafty. Noise, smells, and movement from other people or animals were constant, leaving little relief or quiet. Storage for food and tools had to fit into the same room, adding to clutter. For modern viewers accustomed to separate bedrooms, kitchens, and bathrooms, this living arrangement would seem crowded and uncomfortable. Survival required adaptability, patience, and careful management of space. Daily life revolved around shared routines, cooperation, and enduring conditions that modern homes would consider harsh or unsanitary. The one-room home forced families to balance warmth, comfort, and functionality within a single, constantly used space. Reason 28. Cold and damp homes. Anglo-Saxon homes were often cold and damp, especially during winter or rainy seasons. Walls made of wattle and daub or simple wood offered little insulation, and floors were usually dirt, which absorbed moisture. Roofs thatched with straw leaked during heavy rain, letting water drip inside. The central hearth provided some warmth, but smoke filled the room and only heated a small area. Families huddled together for body heat, layering woolen clothing to stay warm. Dampness made bedding uncomfortable and increased the risk of illness, including respiratory problems and joint pain. Food and belongings could become damp or moldy, adding to daily hardship. For modern viewers used to insulated houses, central heating, and dry floors, living in such conditions would feel harsh and unhealthy. Survival required careful use of fire, layering of clothes, and constant attention to keeping dry. Daily life involved enduring cold, planning around weather, and accepting discomfort as normal. Cold and damp homes shaped routines, health, and comfort, making environmental conditions one of the everyday challenges of Anglo-Saxon life. Reason 29. Diseases from animals. In Anglo-Saxon England, living close to animals exposed people to diseases that could pass from livestock to humans. Cows, sheep, goats, and pigs often shared living space or stayed very near homes, carrying bacteria, parasites, and other germs. People could catch infections through contact with animal waste, milk, or fur. Common illnesses included skin infections, intestinal parasites, and fevers. Without knowledge of germs or effective medical treatment, these diseases could become serious or even fatal. Children were particularly vulnerable because they spent more time near animals and on the floor where contamination was common. Preventing illness required careful cleaning, which was limited by tools, fuel, and water availability. For modern viewers, the constant risk of disease from everyday animals would seem alarming. Survival meant balancing the need to protect valuable livestock with the dangers they brought into the home. Daily life required vigilance, basic hygiene practices, and accepting that contact with animals carried hidden risks. Diseases from animals were an unseen but persistent threat that shaped health, work, and household routines in every Anglo-Saxon village. Reason 30. Belief in evil spirits. In Anglo-Saxon England, many illnesses and misfortunes were thought to be caused by evil spirits or curses. People believed that fevers, sudden pain, or mental distress could be the work of supernatural forces rather than natural causes. Treatments often included prayers, charms, rituals, or the use of herbs believed to ward off spirits. This meant that medical care was inconsistent and sometimes ineffective, as the real causes of disease were not understood. Fear of spirits could also influence daily behavior, making people cautious about certain places, times, or activities. Families might avoid traveling at night, entering forests alone, or breaking local taboos to prevent misfortune. For modern viewers used to scientific explanations for sickness, this reliance on superstition would seem strange or risky. Survival required navigating both real physical dangers and imagined supernatural threats. Daily life involved rituals, caution, and beliefs that shaped decisions, from work to health. The fear of evil spirits added an invisible layer of risk to every action, influencing behavior and community rules alongside practical challenges like hunger, weather, and disease. Reason 31. Herbs and prayers as treatment. In Anglo-Saxon England, most medical treatments relied on simple herbs, natural remedies, and prayers rather than scientific knowledge. People used plants like nettles, willow bark, or garlic to treat wounds, fevers, or digestive problems. Spells, charms, and prayers were often added, as illness was believed to come from evil spirits or divine displeasure. While some herbs had mild medicinal effects, treatments were inconsistent and could fail entirely. Serious infections, broken bones, or internal illnesses usually had no effective cure. Families had to improvise care at home, often relying on local healers or elders with experience in herbal remedies. Knowledge was passed down orally, and mistakes could be dangerous. For modern viewers used to hospitals, antibiotics, and advanced surgery, this system seems unreliable and risky. Survival required practical skill, patience, and acceptance that remedies might not work. Daily life involved constant observation of health, improvisation with available plants, and combining superstition with practical care. Healing was slow, uncertain, and shaped by both belief and experience rather than guaranteed results. Reason 32. Storms destroying crops. In Anglo-Saxon England, sudden storms could ruin entire fields of crops in a single night. Heavy rain, hail, or strong winds damaged wheat, barley, and vegetables, leaving families with little to eat or store for the coming months. Because farming relied on simple tools, unpredictable weather, and limited knowledge of soil management, one bad storm could create months of hardship. Livestock might also be affected, with flooding or fallen trees causing injury or death. Villagers had few ways to protect crops beyond fences or raised beds, and storage facilities were basic, so ruined harvests often meant hunger or poverty. For modern viewers used to weather forecasts, insurance, and irrigation, this vulnerability would seem extreme. Survival depended on careful observation of weather, preparation for sudden storms, and sometimes sheer luck. Daily life included constant awareness of environmental conditions, planning labor and planting around seasons, and accepting that a single storm could undo months of work. Storms were a hidden threat that shaped food security, household stability, and long-term survival in every Anglo-Saxon village. Reason 33. Broken legs could end work. In Anglo-Saxon England, a serious injury like a broken leg could prevent someone from working, which threatened both survival and family support. Most people relied on physical labor for farming, carrying water, or tending animals, so being unable to work meant food could run low and resources became scarce. Medical treatment was extremely limited. Bones were rarely set properly, and infections or improper healing were common. A broken leg could leave someone disabled for life, forcing families to redistribute work or rely on neighbors for help. Children, the elderly, and the injured were particularly vulnerable during this time. For modern viewers, where hospitals, casts, and physical therapy are available, the idea of losing mobility without support seems shocking. Survival required careful attention to safety during daily tasks and acceptance that accidents could have long-term consequences. Daily life included balancing labor demands, risk management, and reliance on family or community support to recover. Physical injury was more than temporary pain. It could threaten livelihood and, in some cases, Life itself. Reason 34. Frequent food shortages. In Anglo-Saxon England, families often faced food shortages due to poor harvests, theft, or spoilage. Meals were simple, usually consisting of porridge, bread, and occasional vegetables or meat. When supplies ran low, families had to ration carefully, sometimes going hungry for days. Malnutrition weakened the body, making people more susceptible to illness or injury. Children and the elderly were especially at risk during shortages. Villagers had few alternatives. Wild plants, berries, or fishing could supplement diets, but these were unreliable. Planning and storage were essential, but even the best preparations could fail if weather, pests, or raids destroyed food. For modern viewers, living with unpredictable access to food would feel extreme. Survival required careful management of resources, creativity in finding additional food, and endurance through periods of hunger. Daily life was shaped by the constant possibility of scarcity, and the ability to adapt could determine whether a family thrived or struggled to survive. Food shortages made even ordinary tasks more difficult, as energy and strength were often limited. Reason 35. Limited travel beyond villages. In Anglo-Saxon England, most people rarely traveled far from their home village. Roads were rough, dangerous, and poorly maintained, and long journeys exposed travelers to robbers, wild animals, and harsh weather. Villagers depended on local resources for food, work, and social needs, so there was little reason or ability to travel. News from distant places traveled slowly, and trade was mostly local. Those who ventured far risked injury, illness, or getting lost in forests and rivers. Children and the elderly usually stayed close to home, while able-bodied adults handled necessary travel. For modern viewers used to easy transportation and global communication, this isolation seems extreme. Survival required relying on local knowledge, building strong community ties, and accepting limits on opportunity and movement. Daily life was tied closely to the village, and personal experience of the outside world was rare. Isolation shaped social, economic, and cultural life, making each community self-reliant and cautious about travel beyond familiar territory. Reason 36. Wolves in forests. In Anglo-Saxon England, wolves still lived in some forests, posing a real threat to people and livestock. Villagers had to be cautious when working near woods or traveling through them, especially at night. Wolves could attack sheep, goats, or even children if left unguarded. Hunting or defending against them required weapons like spears or bows, and knowledge of animal behavior. Encounters were unpredictable, and isolated homes were particularly vulnerable. Communities sometimes organized patrols or placed dogs near herds for protection, but these measures were not always enough. For modern viewers used to the absence of large predators in settled areas, living with wolves nearby would seem frightening. Survival required constant vigilance, protective strategies for livestock, and respect for natural dangers. Daily life involved planning routes, monitoring animals, and balancing work with safety. The presence of wolves shaped where people lived, how they farmed, and how they moved, creating an ongoing tension between human activity and the wild environment surrounding Anglo-Saxon villages. Reason 37. Dependence on family for safety. In Anglo-Saxon England, survival relied heavily on family support. Villagers depended on relatives for protection, food, and labor, especially during illness, injury, or attacks. Extended families often lived close together or in the same house, sharing responsibilities for work and defense. A lone individual was vulnerable to accidents, robbery, or disease, so cooperation was essential. Family ties determined social standing, access to resources, and legal protection, including the payment of wargeld in case of disputes. Disputes with other families could involve everyone, making unity critical. For modern viewers, where individual independence is more common, this level of reliance might seem extreme. Daily life involved constant interaction, cooperation, and shared labor to ensure that every member survived. Decisions, from farming to travel, were shaped by family needs and protection. In this society, family was not just social support, it was the primary means of survival, security, and maintaining one's place in the community. Reason 38. Risk of being captured or enslaved. In Anglo-Saxon England, people could be captured during raids, wars, or even local disputes and forced into slavery. Captives were taken to work for other households, sometimes far from home, with little hope of return. Slavery was harsh. People performed hard labor, lived under strict control, and had limited rights. Families could lose members, reducing their ability to work, defend themselves, or maintain farms. Children were especially vulnerable, and even adults faced sudden, unpredictable threats. The fear of capture affected travel, trade, and daily routines, as villagers remained cautious near outsiders or remote areas. For modern viewers, the constant possibility of being enslaved would seem shocking and terrifying. Survival required vigilance, community support, and sometimes avoidance of risky situations. Daily life involved awareness of both local and external threats, balancing work, safety, and social obligations to protect oneself and one's family from being taken. The threat of capture was an invisible danger shaping behavior and choices throughout Anglo-Saxon society. Reason 39. Riches versus poverty. In Anglo-Saxon England, there was a huge gap between rich nobles and poor farmers. Nobles lived in large wooden halls with plenty of food, clothes, and protection, while common people struggled to grow enough to survive. Wealth determined access to weapons, land, and safety from raids or legal disputes. Poor families often had little land, meager homes, and relied entirely on hard labor to feed themselves. Social mobility was limited, and misfortune could quickly push a family into hunger or debt. For modern viewers, the extreme inequality and dependence on birth status would seem unfair and harsh. Survival required accepting one's social position, working constantly, and depending on community ties for support. Daily life was shaped by these social differences, influencing food, clothing, shelter, and opportunities. The contrast between rich and poor affected security, comfort, and even life expectancy, making wealth and status central to survival in Anglo-Saxon England. Reason 40. Lack of weapons or armor. Most common people in Anglo-Saxon England did not own weapons or armor. Farmers and villagers relied on simple tools like axes or farming implements for work, which offered little protection in case of raids, fights, or wild animal attacks. Without proper weapons, defending themselves or their families was extremely difficult. Only wealthier individuals or nobles could afford swords, shields, or chainmail. Villagers often had to band together for protection, relying on numbers rather than equipment. The lack of defense made theft, assault, or capture a constant risk. For modern viewers used to police protection or personal safety measures, this vulnerability would seem extreme. Survival required vigilance, improvisation, and trust in neighbors. Daily life involved balancing work, household tasks, and safety, knowing that danger could strike at any time and that one's personal defenses were minimal. The absence of proper weapons or armor shaped behavior, travel, and social organization in every village. Reason 41. Heavy wool clothing. In Anglo-Saxon England, most people wore thick wool garments for warmth, but these clothes were heavy, scratchy, and slow to dry. Layering was necessary during cold or wet weather, making movement cumbersome, especially during farm work or travel. Wet clothing could lead to discomfort, sickness, or even frostbite in winter. Wool was difficult to clean, and infrequent washing meant it could smell or carry lice and other pests. For modern viewers used to lightweight, breathable, and waterproof fabrics, wearing heavy, damp wool all day would seem exhausting and uncomfortable. Survival required endurance, careful management of layers, and tolerance for discomfort. Daily life involved adapting to physical limitations imposed by clothing while performing demanding tasks. Despite its drawbacks, wool was essential for warmth and modesty, illustrating how basic needs shaped practical choices in clothing and daily routines. Reason 42. Cold, soaking rain. In Anglo-Saxon England, heavy rain could soak people and their clothes for days, as waterproof clothing was non-existent. Working in fields, traveling, or tending animals during wet weather left villagers constantly wet and chilled. Dampness increased the risk of illness, fatigue, and hypothermia, especially in winter. Homes offered little protection from persistent rain, with thatched roofs sometimes leaking and dirt floors becoming muddy. Wet clothing and bedding were uncomfortable and hard to dry, making rest difficult. For modern viewers accustomed to rain jackets, boots, and heated homes, this constant exposure would seem harsh and exhausting. Survival required resilience, careful planning, and finding ways to stay as dry as possible. Daily life involved adapting work schedules, protecting food and possessions from water, and enduring discomfort as a normal part of living. Rain was not just inconvenient, it could threaten health, productivity, and even life. Reason 43. Open fires for cooking and heating. In Anglo-Saxon homes, the same open fire was used for both cooking and heating. There were no stoves or chimneys, so smoke filled the room, making breathing difficult and causing soot to coat walls and ceilings. The fire was essential for warmth and preparing food, but it required constant attention to maintain heat and prevent accidents. Sparks could ignite straw roofs or nearby belongings, creating a serious fire hazard. Families had to balance proximity to the fire for warmth with the discomfort of smoke and heat. Children spent much of their time near the hearth, increasing exposure to both danger and smoke. For modern viewers used to separate cooking appliances and central heating, this arrangement would seem risky and uncomfortable. Survival required skill, vigilance, and endurance. Daily life revolved around the hearth, managing fuel, preparing meals, keeping warm, and preventing fire, making it the central and most hazardous part of the home. Reason 44. Dark homes even in daytime. Anglo-Saxon homes were often dark inside, even during the day. Small windows, usually covered with cloth or thin animal hide, let in little sunlight. The walls were thick, and thatched roofs blocked light, leaving interiors dim and shadowy. Smoke from indoor fires added to the gloom, making it hard to see clearly. Activities like cooking, sewing, or repairing tools were performed in poor light, straining eyes and slowing work. Darkness also made it easier for pests or intruders to go unnoticed. For modern viewers used to bright homes and electric lighting, living in almost constant dimness would feel uncomfortable and limiting. Survival required adapting to low light conditions, using fire or candles carefully, and accepting slower, more cautious work routines. Daily life was shaped by this lack of natural illumination, affecting productivity, safety, and comfort within the home. Darkness was an unavoidable part of everyday Anglo-Saxon life. Reason 45. Hard daily farm work. In Anglo-Saxon England, farm work required intense labor every day. Planting, tending, and harvesting crops, along with caring for animals, was physically demanding and often done from sunrise to sunset. Simple tools like wooden plows, hoes, and sickles made tasks slower and more exhausting. Everyone in the family, including children, contributed to the workload. There were few breaks, and failure to complete tasks could threaten food supply and survival. Harsh weather, pests, or poor soil made work even harder. For modern viewers used to machinery, comfort, and shorter workdays, this constant physical strain would seem extreme. Survival required strength, endurance, and discipline. Daily life revolved around repetitive, tiring labor with little rest, and the success of the family often depended entirely on their ability to work the land efficiently. Farming was not just a job, it was the foundation of survival, shaping every aspect of daily life in Anglo-Saxon villages. Reason 46. Dependence on animals for farming. In Anglo-Saxon England, animals like oxen, cows, and horses were essential for almost every aspect of farming. Plowing fields, transporting goods, and even grinding grain relied on their strength. Without animals, a family could not cultivate enough land to produce sufficient food or manage heavy labor. Caring for these animals was a full-time responsibility. They needed feeding, shelter, and protection from predators. If an ox or horse became sick, injured, or died, the family's survival could be at serious risk, as replacement animals were expensive or hard to find. Children often helped tend to livestock, while adults worked the fields alongside them, creating a constant cycle of work from dawn to dusk. Seasonal changes added more challenges. Winter meant keeping animals warm and fed when grass and fodder were scarce, while summer required long hours watering and grazing them. For modern viewers used to machines and tractors, relying entirely on animals for basic farming would seem exhausting and uncertain. Survival depended not only on the skill of humans, but also on the health, strength, and cooperation of animals. Daily life was structured around the needs of these animals, from feeding schedules to protecting them from theft or predators, showing just how interconnected people's survival was with the creatures they depended on. Reason 47. Restricted hunting rights. In Anglo-Saxon England, hunting was not a free activity for everyone. Rights to hunt were often controlled by local lords or landowners. Common people could not simply hunt deer, boar, or other game on certain lands without permission, and doing so illegally could result in fines, beatings, or worse. Hunting was not only a source of food, but also a way to supplement income, so restrictions directly affected survival. Families had to rely on small game, fish, or foraging for wild plants when access to larger animals was limited. Tools for hunting, such as bows, arrows, or traps, were also expensive, making it difficult for poor villagers to defend themselves or secure protein-rich food. Even traveling into forests for firewood or grazing animals carried the risk of accidentally breaking hunting laws. For modern viewers accustomed to open access to public lands and game regulations designed for sustainability, these strict social rules might seem oppressive. Survival required obedience to local laws, negotiation with landowners, and cleverness in finding alternative food sources. Daily life included balancing the need for nourishment with the risks of breaking hunting restrictions, showing how law and social hierarchy directly shaped both diet and safety in Anglo-Saxon communities. Reason 48. Repeated famine. In Anglo-Saxon England, a single poor harvest could lead to famine, but several bad years in a row were devastating. Crops could fail due to drought, floods, pests, or disease, leaving families with little or no food to eat or store. Grain, vegetables, and livestock could all be affected, and communities had few ways to import supplies from other regions. During these times, people survived on wild plants, roots, or anything edible they could forage, but these sources were unreliable and often insufficient. Malnutrition became common, weakening the body and making illness more likely. Children and the elderly were especially at risk, and death rates increased sharply during extended periods of hunger. Villagers had to carefully ration remaining food, share with neighbors, or beg for aid from wealthier families or monasteries. For modern viewers used to grocery stores and food security, the idea of multiple years of near starvation is hard to imagine. Survival depended on careful planning, knowledge of edible plants, and community cooperation. Daily life during repeated famine involved fear, constant awareness of food scarcity, and making difficult choices about who ate and when. Famine shaped work, social relations, and even moral decisions, showing how dependent life was on unpredictable harvests and the natural environment. Reason 49. Simple meals. In Anglo-Saxon England, most people ate very simple meals, usually consisting of porridge, bread, and occasionally vegetables or small amounts of meat. Luxury ingredients like sugar, spices, or imported foods were rare and mostly reserved for the wealthy. Meals were cooked over an open fire, often in one pot, and flavors were basic. People ate to survive rather than for enjoyment, and variety was minimal. Seasonal changes affected diet heavily. Winter meant relying on stored grains and preserved foods, while summer allowed some fresh vegetables or herbs. Cooking methods were primitive, so food could be undercooked, burned, or contaminated by smoke and dirt. Children, the elderly, and laborers often went hungry if portions were small or food ran low. For modern viewers used to supermarkets, diverse diets, and refrigeration, the monotony and scarcity of meals would seem harsh. Survival required careful rationing, adapting to whatever food was available, and making every meal count. Daily life revolved around preparing, cooking, and protecting the limited food supply, showing how even basic nutrition was a constant challenge and central to family well-being in Anglo-Saxon villages. Reason 50. Rare meat for poor families. In Anglo-Saxon England, meat was a rare luxury for most common families. Only wealthy nobles had regular access to beef, pork, or game, while peasants relied mostly on grains, vegetables, and occasionally dairy. Hunting rights and land ownership limited access to animals, and livestock was more valuable alive for milk, labor, or breeding than as food. When meat was available, it was usually reserved for special occasions or festivals. Poor families sometimes scavenged small game, fish, or birds, but these sources were unpredictable and often insufficient. Preservation was minimal, so any meat had to be consumed quickly or salted if available. Malnutrition was common, and protein shortages weakened bodies, making illness and fatigue more likely. For modern viewers used to supermarkets and a variety of protein sources, this scarcity would seem extreme. Survival required relying on available plant-based foods, careful use of rare meat, and planning around seasonal availability. Daily life included prioritizing nutrition, protecting livestock, and adjusting meals according to what could be safely consumed, showing how access to even basic protein was a constant challenge in Anglo-Saxon society. Reason 51. No real dental care. In Anglo-Saxon England, dental care was almost non-existent. People had no dentists, no toothbrushes, and no toothpaste as we know them today. Toothaches, cavities, and gum infections were common and often extremely painful. Families tried home remedies like rinsing with salt water, chewing herbs, or applying poultices made from plants, but these offered limited relief. Sometimes, people used small metal tools to remove teeth themselves, which could be dangerous and cause infection. Poor dental health could make eating difficult, weakening the body, especially during winters or times of food scarcity. Infections from teeth could spread to other parts of the body, occasionally becoming life-threatening. Sugar was rare, but coarse bread, grains, and residues from food could still decay teeth over time. Children were particularly vulnerable because their teeth were softer, and pain could interfere with eating or school-like chores. For modern viewers accustomed to regular brushing, dental checkups, and anesthesia, this lack of care would seem shocking and dangerous. Survival required tolerance for constant pain, knowledge of herbal remedies, and improvisation in case of severe tooth problems. Daily life was affected by oral health. Chewing food, sleeping comfortably, and maintaining nutrition were all impacted. Dental problems were not just a minor discomfort. They could influence overall health, work capacity, and quality of life in every Anglo-Saxon household. Reason 52. Infections were a major cause of death. In Anglo-Saxon England, infections were one of the biggest dangers to life because medical knowledge and treatments were extremely limited. Even a small cut, scratch, or insect bite could become infected and turn deadly. Without antibiotics, proper wound care, or sterilization, germs from soil, animals, or unclean hands could easily enter the body. People tried using herbs, poultices, or prayers, but these remedies were often ineffective against serious infections. Illnesses like boils, abscesses, or fevers could spread rapidly within families or villages, sometimes leading to death within days. Poor hygiene, crowded living conditions, and shared spaces with animals increased the risk. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable because their immune systems were weaker. Common infections included skin infections, respiratory problems, and gastrointestinal diseases caused by contaminated food or water. For modern viewers used to hospitals, antiseptics, and vaccinations, living in a world where simple infections could be fatal seems extreme and frightening. Survival depended on constant vigilance, cleaning wounds carefully, observing early signs of illness, and seeking help from local healers. Daily life was shaped by the invisible threat of infection, influencing work, food preparation, and personal hygiene. Even routine tasks like farming, cooking, or tending animals carried hidden risks. Infections were an ever-present danger that could strike anyone at any time, making everyday survival uncertain and fragile in Anglo-Saxon England. Reason 53. High child mortality. In Anglo-Saxon England, many children did not survive past a young age due to disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Illnesses such as measles, smallpox, or respiratory infections spread easily in crowded homes and villages, and without effective medicine, even minor sicknesses could become fatal. Poor nutrition weakened children's immune systems, making them more vulnerable to infections. Birth complications and lack of medical knowledge also contributed to high infant mortality. Families had few ways to prevent or treat these dangers, relying mostly on herbal remedies, prayers, and experience passed down through generations. Children who survived often had to begin work at an early age, helping with farming, tending animals, or household chores, which could be physically demanding and dangerous. For modern viewers accustomed to pediatric care, vaccinations, and hospitals, these conditions seem shocking and harsh. Survival required constant attention, care, and protection from family members, with every healthy child being a blessing rather than a guarantee. Daily life for families was filled with concern over children's health, balancing work, food, and safety. High child mortality shaped family planning, emotional life, and social structures, making the survival of the next generation uncertain and precious. In this environment, the loss of children was a tragic but common part of life, influencing how families lived, worked, and planned for the future. Reason 54. Short life expectancy. In Anglo-Saxon England, most people never lived past their 40s, and many died much younger. Harsh living conditions, frequent illness, poor nutrition, accidents, and the constant threat of violence or raids all contributed to short lifespans. Even those who survived childhood faced dangers from infections, famine, and hard labor. Physical work from a young age, exposure to extreme weather, and living close to animals increased the risk of injury and disease. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatments were often ineffective, leaving people vulnerable to conditions that are easily treated today. High mortality affected family structure, social life, and community organization. Families relied on many children to ensure some survived to adulthood, and elders who lived longer were respected for their wisdom and experience. For modern viewers accustomed to hospitals, vaccinations, and modern hygiene, the idea that most people died in their 40s or earlier seems extreme and almost unimaginable. Survival required endurance, practical skills, and constant attention to health and safety. Daily life involved balancing labor, food, and protection, while understanding that life was fragile and uncertain. Short life expectancy influenced marriage, inheritance, and social roles, shaping every aspect of Anglo-Saxon society. Living with the knowledge that death could come early was a constant reality that guided choices, behavior, and priorities. Reason 55. Snowstorms isolating villages. In Anglo-Saxon England, heavy snowstorms could cut off entire villages from the outside world for days or even weeks. Roads became impassable, rivers froze, and travel between settlements was extremely dangerous or impossible. This isolation meant that food, firewood, and medical help could run low, leaving families to survive on whatever supplies they had stored. Livestock could become trapped or starve if grazing land was buried under snow, further threatening survival. Communication with neighboring villages or lords was limited, so news of threats or assistance could be delayed. Children, the elderly, and the sick were especially vulnerable during these periods. For modern viewers used to snowplows, vehicles, and emergency services, living through a snowstorm that completely cut off access would seem frightening and difficult to manage. Survival required careful preparation, stockpiling food and firewood, and tending to animals under extreme conditions. Daily life during snowstorms involved constant effort to stay warm, cook, and maintain hygiene while dealing with limited resources. Snowstorms shaped routines, restricted movement, and increased dependence on family and neighbors. They were not just inconvenient weather events. They could be life-threatening challenges that tested endurance, planning, and resourcefulness in Anglo-Saxon communities. Reason 56 dangerous rivers. In Anglo-Saxon England, rivers could become life-threatening during heavy rain or flooding. Villages often relied on rivers for water, fishing, and transport, but swollen currents could sweep away people, animals, or even parts of homes. Bridges were rare, so crossing a fast river required skill, strength, and luck. Sudden storms could turn calm streams into raging torrents in a short time, catching travelers or workers by surprise. Flooded fields destroyed crops and pastures, reducing food supply and threatening livestock. Children were especially at risk near riverbanks, and families had to constantly monitor water levels during wet seasons. For modern viewers used to engineer dams, levees, and warning systems, the unpredictability of rivers would seem extreme and dangerous. Survival required careful planning, timing activities around weather, and sometimes avoiding essential tasks near water. Daily life was shaped by the presence of rivers as both a resource and a hazard, influencing where people built homes, tended animals, and traveled. Rivers offered food and transportation, but demanded respect, vigilance, and adaptability to avoid accidents or disaster. Reason 57. Candles and firelight at night. In Anglo-Saxon England, after sunset, people had very limited sources of light. Homes had no electricity, and the primary means of illumination were small candles, rushlights, or the central hearth fire. These lights were dim, flickering, and often smoky, barely lighting a single room. Tasks like cooking, sewing, repairing tools, or reading were difficult in such weak light, straining eyes and slowing work. Families had to plan daily activities around available daylight, finishing labor-intensive chores before darkness fell. Nighttime travel was extremely dangerous due to poor visibility, rough roads, and the threat of robbers or wild animals. The cost and scarcity of candles meant they were often used sparingly, reserved for essential tasks or emergencies. Children's play, learning, and social activities were limited after dark, and homes could feel oppressive or isolating. For modern viewers used to electric lighting, street lamps, and instant visibility, living in near constant dimness at night would seem harsh and inconvenient. Survival required careful planning, prioritizing activities during daylight, and using firelight efficiently. Daily life revolved around managing shadows and limited visibility, balancing the need for light with safety and resources. Nighttime was not just a period of rest. It posed hidden dangers and challenges, influencing routines, social behavior, and the way families organized life around light and darkness in Anglo-Saxon England. Reason 58. Traveling after dark. In Anglo-Saxon England, traveling after dark was extremely risky and often avoided unless absolutely necessary. Villages were connected by rough, unpaved paths that became difficult to navigate without sunlight. Dense forests, uneven terrain, and hidden ditches made walking dangerous, while rivers and streams could not be easily seen or crossed safely at night. Robbers and thieves often took advantage of darkness to ambush travelers, and wild animals such as wolves posed an additional threat. Families were aware that leaving the village after sunset could mean injury, theft, or even death, so travel schedules were strictly planned around daylight hours. Those who had to travel for trade, work, or urgent matters carried torches or small lanterns, but these provided limited light and attracted attention. Poor weather, fog, or snow worsened visibility, making even short journeys perilous. For modern viewers used to streetlights, GPS, and safe nighttime transport, the dangers of traveling after dark would seem extreme and frightening. Survival required careful planning, knowledge of the terrain, and sometimes traveling in groups to reduce risk. Daily life was structured around the cycles of light and darkness, limiting movement, communication, and trade. Darkness was not merely inconvenient, it controlled daily routines, restricted freedom, and imposed constant caution on anyone leaving home after nightfall, making night travel a serious challenge in Anglo-Saxon England. Reason 59. Dense forests and getting lost. In Anglo-Saxon England, forests covered large areas and were often thick, dark, and difficult to navigate. Villagers relied on these woods for firewood, foraging, and sometimes hunting, but the dense trees, undergrowth, and uneven terrain made it easy to get lost. Trails were few and poorly marked, and landmarks could be hard to recognize, especially for children or travelers unfamiliar with the area. Getting lost could mean exposure to wild animals, harsh weather, or dangerous terrain, and finding one's way back could take hours or even days. Forests were also home to wolves, wild boars, and other predators, which increased the risks of venturing too far. People often traveled in groups, carried simple tools or weapons, and memorized natural signs to navigate safely, but accidents still happened. For modern viewers used to roads, maps, and GPS, the constant danger of losing one's way in the woods would seem extreme. Survival required awareness, memory, and understanding of the natural environment. Daily life included careful planning of forest trips, avoiding unnecessary journeys, and balancing the need for resources with safety. Dense forests shaped settlement patterns, work routines, and travel habits, making the wilderness both a vital resource and a persistent threat in Anglo-Saxon England. Reason 60. Robbers hiding along forest paths. In Anglo-Saxon England, traveling outside villages was dangerous because robbers often hid along forest paths and poorly maintained roads. These criminals targeted lone travelers or small groups, stealing food, tools, money, or valuables. There were no organized police forces, and law enforcement was local, slow, and sometimes ineffective, leaving villagers vulnerable. Attacks could be violent, resulting in injury or even death, and the threat forced people to plan journeys carefully. Travelers often carried weapons like small knives, staffs, or bows for protection, but defense relied on skill, luck, and numbers. Merchants and messengers transporting goods were particularly at risk, and trade between villages could be limited due to fear of ambush. Seasonal conditions like fog, rain, or early darkness increased danger, as robbers could easily remain hidden. For modern viewers used to well-lit roads, emergency services, and security systems, the constant possibility of robbery along a path would seem extreme and frightening. Survival required vigilance, group travel, knowledge of safe routes, and timing journeys to avoid danger. Daily life was shaped by this risk, influencing decisions about where and when to travel, how to carry valuables, and how to interact with outsiders. The presence of robbers created a persistent tension that affected mobility, trade, and safety in Anglo-Saxon communities, making even routine journeys potentially life-threatening. Reason 61. Strong influence of religion. In Anglo-Saxon England, religion played a central role in every aspect of daily life, guiding behavior, decisions, and social interactions. Christianity had spread widely, and churches and monasteries held considerable influence over communities, while older pagan beliefs still persisted in some areas. People believed that illness, misfortune, or natural disasters could be punishments from God or the result of evil spirits, so they often sought guidance from priests or performed rituals to gain favor. Religious observances dictated the rhythm of daily life, including work, rest, and celebrations. Festivals, fasts, and holy days structured the calendar, while moral and ethical rules shaped social behavior. Those who defied religious norms risked social disapproval, fines, or even harsh punishments. Education, written records, and literacy were largely controlled by the church, giving clergy power over knowledge and communication. For modern viewers accustomed to secular governance and individual freedom, this level of religious influence may seem extreme and all-encompassing. Survival required adherence to religious expectations, participation in rituals, and respect for the moral authority of local clergy. Daily life involved balancing work, family responsibilities, and religious duties, often with little distinction between the sacred and the ordinary. Religion affected health, justice, social hierarchy, and community cohesion, making it a constant presence that guided behavior, influenced decisions, and shaped the social fabric of Anglo-Saxon England. Reason 62. Power of the Church. In Anglo-Saxon England, churches and monasteries were not only places of worship, but also centers of power that influenced law, education, and daily life. Priests and monks often controlled access to knowledge, recorded important documents, and provided guidance on moral and legal matters. Wealthy monasteries could own land, collect tithes, and support armies or militias, giving them influence over local politics. Villagers relied on the church for spiritual support, education, and advice on disputes, but the church could also impose penalties or social pressure for perceived wrongdoing. Religious leaders had the authority to enforce moral codes, dictate acceptable behavior, and determine community norms, affecting what people could say, do, or eat. Churches served as meeting points, marketplaces, and safe havens, but their power extended into nearly every aspect of life. For modern viewers used to a separation between religion and governance, the church's influence over daily life and social order would seem overwhelming. Survival required understanding and respecting religious authority, participating in church activities, and navigating social expectations carefully. Daily life was intertwined with church schedules, festivals, and moral rules. The church shaped education, justice, and social hierarchy, making spiritual and temporal power inseparable. Its influence guided behavior, protected communities, but also enforced conformity, showing how deeply religious institutions affected Anglo-Saxon society and individual survival. Reason 63. Harsh and public punishments. In Anglo-Saxon England, punishments for crimes were often harsh and carried out in public, serving as both retribution and a warning to others. Crimes such as theft, assault, or breaking the law could result in fines, whipping, mutilation, or even execution, depending on social status and severity. Public displays of punishment were common, including stocks, pillories, or beatings in the village square, ensuring that everyone witnessed the consequences of wrongdoing. Legal systems were less formal than today, and local lords or community leaders had significant discretion in enforcing laws. Social pressure and shame played a critical role, as being publicly punished could damage reputation, family honor, and opportunities within the community. For modern viewers accustomed to structured legal systems, prisons, and rights-based justice, these punishments may seem cruel and excessive. Survival required understanding local laws, respecting authority, and avoiding disputes that could lead to severe consequences. Daily life involved constant awareness of both formal rules and unwritten social codes, as even minor conflicts could escalate into punishable offenses. Harsh punishments were not just about crime, they reinforced social order, deterred wrongdoing, and ensured that villagers adhered to expectations, making public discipline a central aspect of community life in Anglo-Saxon England. Reason 64. Small arguments turning violent. In Anglo-Saxon England, even minor disagreements could quickly escalate into serious or violent conflicts. Disputes over land, livestock, debts, or personal insults often involved not just the individuals, but their entire families or clans, sometimes lasting for years. Legal systems existed, but enforcement was inconsistent, and people often took matters into their own hands to seek justice or revenge. Fights could involve weapons like knives, clubs, or farm tools, and injuries or deaths were not uncommon. Feuds could destabilize communities, interrupt work, and threaten the safety of villagers. Social norms required families to defend their honor, which meant ignoring or settling disputes quietly was risky. For modern viewers used to formal courts, police protection, and mediation, this constant threat of escalation would seem extreme and frightening. Survival required careful speech, conflict avoidance, and sometimes alliances with stronger neighbors or local leaders. Daily life was shaped by the potential for violence, influencing interactions, travel, and resource management. Small arguments were never trivial. They could trigger cycles of revenge and legal complications, affecting the safety and stability of entire families. The need to navigate social tensions carefully was a constant part of life, teaching villagers caution, diplomacy, and vigilance to survive in a society where disputes could quickly become deadly. Reason 65. Limited land ownership. In Anglo-Saxon England, most families owned very little land, and many worked as tenants or laborers on larger estates controlled by nobles or local lords. Land determined wealth, food supply, and social status, so having limited property meant families had fewer resources and less security. Poor villagers often cultivated small plots, barely producing enough to feed themselves. while also owing rent, labor, or a share of their harvest to the landowner. Disputes over boundaries or inheritance could leave families vulnerable to losing even the small amount of land they had. Limited land also restricted opportunities for expanding farms, keeping animals, or growing surplus food for trade. For modern viewers used to private property rights and the ability to buy or lease land, this lack of control over one's livelihood might seem extreme. Survival required careful management of tiny plots, cooperation with neighbors, and constant effort to maximize productivity. Daily life involved intensive labor, planning crops and livestock use, and navigating social obligations to landowners. Owning or controlling land was central to survival, affecting nutrition, shelter, work, and security. The scarcity of property meant families had to work harder, rely on communal support, and accept the limitations imposed by social hierarchy, making land a critical and sometimes precarious foundation for life in Anglo-Saxon England. Reason 66: Common hunger. In Anglo-Saxon England, hunger was a constant threat, especially for poor families who relied entirely on their own crops and livestock. A failed harvest, bad weather, pests, or disease could leave people with very little to eat. Villagers often survived on porridge, bread, and whatever vegetables or wild plants they could find, while meat and dairy were scarce and reserved for special occasions. Food storage was limited, and preservation techniques were primitive, so supplies spoiled quickly, increasing the risk of shortages. Children, the elderly, and sick individuals were particularly vulnerable to malnutrition, which could weaken them and make illnesses more deadly. Famine could force families to forage in forests, trade valuables for food, or seek help from wealthier neighbors or monasteries. For modern viewers used to supermarkets, refrigeration, and a wide variety of food year-round, this daily struggle for sustenance would seem extreme and frightening. Survival required careful planning, rationing, and knowledge of seasonal resources. Daily life was organized around the availability of food, with long hours devoted to planting, tending, and storing crops. Hunger shaped social behavior, community support networks, and even moral decisions, as sharing or hoarding food could determine who lived or died. It was a constant, pressing danger that influenced nearly every aspect of life in Anglo-Saxon villages. Reason 67: Long, cold winters. In Anglo-Saxon England, winters were long, harsh, and uncomfortable, often lasting several months with freezing temperatures, snow, and ice. Villagers faced constant cold in homes with dirt floors, thatched roofs, and little insulation. Fires were essential for warmth, but fuel like wood or peat had to be gathered and rationed carefully, and smoke-filled rooms made breathing difficult. Cold weather made daily chores harder. Fetching water, tending animals, and working in fields became physically exhausting and dangerous. Frost and snow could destroy crops, limit access to food, and isolate villages from neighboring communities or markets. Illnesses like pneumonia, frostbite, or hypothermia were real threats, especially for children, the elderly, and the sick. Wet and frozen conditions also made travel extremely risky, increasing the danger of accidents or exposure. For modern viewers accustomed to central heating, insulated homes, and winter clothing, enduring these winters would seem harsh and grueling. Survival required careful preparation, stockpiling food and fuel, layering clothing, and constant vigilance to keep homes and livestock safe. Daily life revolved around coping with cold. Chores were timed to daylight. Animals were protected, and food was prioritized to maintain energy. Long winters influenced farming cycles, labor schedules, and community organization, making the cold a central and relentless challenge in Anglo-Saxon England. Reason 68: Continuous hard work. In Anglo-Saxon England, hard work was a constant part of daily life, leaving almost no time for rest or leisure. From sunrise to sunset, villagers labored in fields, tended animals, repaired homes, prepared food, and collected firewood. Children contributed from a very young age, learning to farm, herd animals, or help with household chores. Every task was essential for survival. Failure to maintain crops, livestock, or homes could quickly lead to hunger, illness, or vulnerability to attacks. Seasonal changes dictated the type and intensity of work, with planting and harvest seasons being especially demanding. Even the winter months required tending fires, feeding animals, and repairing structures to withstand harsh weather. People relied heavily on physical strength, endurance, and practical skills, as there were no machines to lighten the burden. For modern viewers used to labor-saving devices, structured work hours, and days off, the relentless nature of life would seem exhausting and unforgiving. Survival depended on continuous effort, careful planning, and cooperation within families and communities. Daily life involved organizing tasks efficiently, sharing labor among family members, and prioritizing essential work over comfort or leisure. This constant cycle of hard work shaped routines, social roles, and the very rhythm of life, making physical labor not just a necessity, but the foundation of survival in Anglo-Saxon England. Reason 69. Dependence on luck, weather, and family. In Anglo-Saxon England, survival often depended less on skill or planning and more on a combination of luck, weather, and family support. Harsh or unpredictable weather could destroy crops, flood homes, or trap villages in snow, leaving families struggling to find food, warmth, and safety. Illness or injury could strike at any time, and without effective medical care, even minor problems could become life-threatening. Families were the primary source of protection, labor, and resources. Neighbors might help, but a family's ability to work together often determined whether they survived a season or year. Random events like raids, wild animal attacks, or fires could destroy everything a household had worked for, making chance a constant factor in daily life. For modern viewers accustomed to social services, emergency systems, and predictable infrastructure, this constant dependence on luck and natural forces would seem harsh and frightening. Survival required vigilance, flexibility, and resilience, as well as maintaining strong family bonds. Daily life involved preparing for unpredictable dangers, sharing responsibilities among family members, and making every resource count. People learned to adapt to the whims of weather, scarcity, and accidents, knowing that no amount of effort could fully guarantee safety or security. In Anglo-Saxon England, life was fragile, and success or failure often rested on factors beyond one's control, making endurance, family cohesion, and adaptability central to surviving each day.